I always was interested in writing music and singing, but I was very shy and almost embarrassed about it.
The Black Sabbath lead singer Ozzy Osbourne has died at the age.
Parkinson's is really tricky. We don't know good days from bad days until you're in it. You can plan and plan and plan and plan, but you just...
While millions watched the Osbournes turn family chaos into primetime entertainment, one member of the household was conspicuously absent, and not just from the screen but from the entire narrative. Aimee Osbourne, the eldest daughter of Ozzy and Sharon, quietly removed herself from the circus at just 16 years old, walking away from the flashing lights, chaotic filming schedules, and the constant buzz of fame that engulfed her household. Unlike her siblings Jack and Kelly, who became television sensations with their wild outbursts and candid confessions, Aimee wanted something the cameras could never offer: peace. She wasn't rebelling for the sake of headlines or rejecting her family in bitterness. She was simply suffocating in a life she never asked for. As MTV producers transformed their home into a global reality phenomenon, Aimee chose self-preservation over celebrity, and that decision carried a hefty emotional price. For years, fans barely knew she existed. Her name was rarely mentioned, her face never shown, and most viewers didn't even realize Ozzy had a third child. The media, eager to amplify the drama and dysfunction, had little interest in the quiet daughter who refused to participate. But that silence, chosen out of necessity, began to define her identity more than her own voice ever could. Within the Osbourne mansion, a rift was forming, not just physical distance, but an emotional gap that widened with every episode aired and every red carpet skipped. While Jack and Kelly were celebrated for their outrageous antics, Aimee became the invisible one, a ghost in her own family story. And the decision to step away from the spotlight didn't just cost her fame, it carved a permanent wedge between her and the rest of the world, leaving her alone in a narrative written without her consent. The girl who walked away from the fame machine became a mystery, a myth, and for many years a forgotten daughter living in the shadow of the world's loudest family. But her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. And it was only the beginning of a story far more emotional, complicated, and courageous than anyone imagined. To the outside world, Ozzy Osbourne was the unpredictable Prince of Darkness, the heavy metal legend who bit the head off a bat, cursed on live TV, and embodied the wildest extremes of rock stardom. But to Aimee, behind the eyeliner, slurred interviews, and thunderous guitars, there was a different man altogether. One who loved deeply, laughed often, and carried far more softness than the world ever got to see. Growing up, Aimee saw moments the cameras never caught. Her father humming lullabies while half asleep, making corny jokes at the dinner table, or slipping into her room late at night just to say "I love you" in his own quiet way. Even amid the chaos of touring, rehab stints, and volatile arguments, Ozzy never stopped trying to be present, even if his version of fatherhood didn't fit any mold. There were moments when he was physically gone for weeks, yet when he returned, he brought gifts, attention, and a kind of wild-eyed affection that was both overwhelming and genuine. He didn't know how to be a conventional dad. He was messy, damaged, and often numb from the weight of his own inner demons, but he tried. And that effort, though imperfect, stayed with Aimee. In the rare pockets of calm, she felt seen, protected, and most importantly, loved. Ozzy had a way of lighting up every room, not just because of his fame but because of the rare magic in his presence, something that lingered long after he left. He'd dance around the kitchen in his robe, whisper encouragement when she felt insecure, and remind her that her voice, however quiet, mattered. For Aimee, those moments created a conflicting emotional truth. The same man who terrified tabloids was also the one who gave her warm hugs and told her she was brilliant. He wasn't a monster, but a complicated, wounded soul trying to give his children a piece of himself even when he didn't feel whole. That contradiction, public spectacle versus private tenderness, created confusion for Aimee, especially as the world cheered on the version of Ozzy she barely recognized. But beneath the fame, the madness, and the music, there was a father whose love, though often buried beneath addiction and distraction, was real. And that reality haunted Aimee more than the chaos ever could, because she knew that somewhere deep inside the man millions idolized and misunderstood, lived a father who wanted to do right by his daughter, even if he didn't know how. What started as a simple choice to stay out of the limelight slowly became something much heavier, an invisible wall that separated Aimee Osbourne, not just from her family but from the very idea of belonging. At first, her decision to walk away from the Osbournes' reality show was met with shrugs, maybe even understanding. She was a teenager, shy, quiet, uninterested in living life as a spectacle. But as the seasons aired and the world devoured every chaotic moment of Jack and Kelly's lives, her Her absence turned from a footnote into a statement, one that neither side fully addressed. With each passing year, the distance between Aimee and her family calcified. There were no big blow-ups, no explosive fights captured on film. Instead, there was just silence. Deep, aching silence. And in that void, assumptions grew. Fans assumed she was cold, aloof, or even ashamed of her family. The media labeled her the estranged daughter, reducing her complexity to a headline. Even her own parents, lost in the whirlpool of fame, seemed unsure of how to reach her. Inside, Aimee was battling emotions she didn't have words for. Loneliness, confusion, disappointment, and a kind of guilt that crept in whenever she missed them, because how do you miss people who constantly hurt you without meaning to? The more she pulled away to protect her peace, the more isolated she felt. Holidays became tense. Family conversations were short, awkward, or skipped altogether. She watched from afar as her siblings grew into adulthood on magazine covers, while she tried to define her identity in a world that had already written her out of the script. And yet the silence wasn't just avoidance, it was armor. Aimee feared that letting herself get close again would only open wounds she had worked so hard to close. She didn't know how to express that her silence came from pain, not pride, that behind her quiet smiles were years of feeling like the outsider in her own bloodline. And so the wall stayed up, brick by brick, built from missed birthdays, unsaid apologies, and a lifetime of emotional misfires. But what no one realized, not even Aimee, was that while the wall kept out pain, it also kept out healing. And as time marched on and life grew more fragile, that silence, once her safe haven, began to feel like a prison, because the further she drifted from her family, the more she felt something gnawing inside her, a quiet, persistent longing to be seen, not by the world, but by the people who once called her daughter, sister, and family. For years, Aimee Osbourne lived like time was infinite, quietly convinced that one day, maybe when the chaos calmed, she'd find the right moment to reconnect with her father. But in 2020, everything changed in an instant. The news hit headlines and family inboxes alike. Ozzy Osbourne had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And just like that, the illusion of time shattered. At first it didn't seem real. This was the man who had survived decades of drug use, alcohol binges, near-death accidents, and emotional breakdowns, only to return to the stage over and over like a rock and roll phoenix. Fans assumed this would be just another bump in his road, another hurdle for Ozzy to stumble through and somehow conquer. But Aimee felt something different. She saw what others didn't. She noticed the tremor in his hands, the stiffness in his walk, the way his words began to slow and slur, not from intoxication, but from a neurological enemy that couldn't be outrun. And suddenly every silent year between them became unbearably loud. All the missed chances, the unanswered calls, the unresolved tension, they weren't just inconvenient truths anymore. They were ticking clocks. For the first time, Aimee realized that her father might slip away without ever hearing how much she still loved him. The guilt, the sadness, and the longing she had buried for so long surfaced all at once, sharper than ever before. She wasn't just mourning his diagnosis, she was mourning every memory they never made, every birthday not celebrated, every hug that never happened. And the thought of losing him while still carrying all that silence inside her was too much to bear. This wasn't about fame, music, or family reputation anymore. This was about mortality. This was about a daughter realizing that her window to speak, to heal, to be heard, was rapidly closing. And so something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, she stopped protecting herself and started asking what it might cost if she didn't act. Because Parkinson's doesn't pause for clarity, it doesn't wait for forgiveness, it moves forward relentlessly. And Aimee, now faced with the reality of watching her father slowly fade away, knew that her silence, once a shield, had become a threat to something she could never get back: time. Time to say the things she was too afraid to say, time to finally speak her truth, and time to reclaim the love that had been buried under decades of noise, misunderstanding, and quiet pain. It wasn't scripted, planned, or captured by cameras, but when Aimee Osbourne finally walked into that quiet room where her father sat, fragile, fading, and far removed from the thunderous legend he once was, it felt like the world had paused. There were no lights, no producers, no staged entrances, just a daughter staring at a man who had once seemed immortal, now reduced to shaky hands, tired eyes, and the undeniable weight of time. Ozzy Osbourne, the wild rock star who once defied death itself, looked up and saw his daughter, not the one who vanished from the spotlight, but the little girl he used to carry through backstage corridors and whisper bedtime nonsense to, in a voice worn down by decades of screaming into microphones. Aimee wasn't there to perform or seek closure for the sake of drama. She was there because she couldn't carry the silence anymore. She had rehearsed the words in her head for years, but when her mouth opened, they came out trembling, raw, and soaked in truth. She told him she was sorry for leaving, for staying quiet, for pretending she didn't miss him. She confessed how she had longed for peace, not fame, and how the noise of their world had broken something inside her that she hadn't known how to fix. Ozzy didn't interrupt. He didn't offer explanations or excuses. He simply listened, his gaze locked on hers like he was trying to memorize the face of a daughter he'd seen more in dreams than in life. And then, as her voice cracked under the weight of everything she'd buried, she said the one thing she had been most afraid to admit, that she had missed him every single day, even when she stayed away, even when she told herself she didn't need him. And that's when Ozzy, hands shaking but heart steady, reached out and took hers. No words, no show. Just two people, broken in different ways, holding on like it was the first and last time. In that moment, decades of pain melted into something softer, recognition, regret, and something dangerously close to peace. That hug, that quiet embrace, didn't erase the past, but it cracked the wall that had separated them for years. Because sometimes healing doesn't need an apology, it just needs presence. And for the first time in years, they were both finally present, with nothing but honesty between them and everything else, just for a moment, finally fading away. She hadn't meant for the world to know. That emotional reunion, the quiet hug, the trembling voice, the tears that said what words never could, was meant to stay behind closed doors. But healing, it turns out, has a ripple effect. As whispers of Aimee Osbourne's return to her father's side began to circulate, the internet lit up with curiosity, shock, and admiration. For years she had been the Osbourne no one really knew, the silent sister whose name was rarely mentioned, the daughter who had chosen peace over primetime. But now her story, so raw, so unpolished, was leaking into the public consciousness. Friends who had witnessed her breakdown behind the scenes shared quiet messages about her bravery. Musicians and close contacts in the industry posted cryptic tributes about the courage it takes to face the pain you once ran from. And those breadcrumbs led to a flood of support, as fans across the world began piecing together a narrative they'd never been told. Aimee hadn't just vanished, she had survived. Not the kind of survival that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that eats away at you while the world keeps clapping. Her choice to step back from fame had never been about ego or anger. It was about self-preservation, in a family where emotional wounds were easy to overlook beneath the glitter of stardom. And now, after decades of silence, her single act of vulnerability, hugging her dying father, resonated with people in a way no reality show or chart-topping single ever could. Online forums buzzed, social media filled with hashtags like "Forgive Ozzy" and "We Love Aimee." Suddenly, the forgotten daughter became a symbol of grace, of truth, of what it means to love someone complicated. People didn't just want gossip, they wanted to understand her, and in doing so, they started to see Ozzy differently too. Not just as the screaming rock god or the out-of-control TV dad, but as a deeply flawed man who had quietly longed for reconciliation with the daughter he barely knew how to love out loud. Aimee didn't give an interview. She didn't post a video. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any PR campaign. By choosing to return, not to the spotlight but to a bedside, she reminded the world of something deeper, that the real stories, the ones that stick with us, often unfold in silence, in grief, and in the quiet courage it takes to forgive without fanfare. It started with a whisper, a private hug between father and daughter, a moment of trembling truth shared in a silent room, but it soon became a global echo that no one could ignore. As word spread of Aimee Osbourne's emotional reunion with her father, something strange and beautiful happened. The world, so often obsessed with spectacle, paused to embrace sincerity. Messages of support flooded social media like a rising tide. Fans who had once written her off as a ghost from the Osbourne past now hailed her as a symbol of quiet strength. Strangers who hadn't spoken to their parents in years suddenly felt a tug to reconnect. "She did what I never could," one user posted. "Her story gave me the courage to call my dad after 6 years of silence," another wrote. Music forums, fan pages, and mainstream outlets lit up, not with gossip but with admiration. And for once the media got it right. Rolling Stone didn't spin her into a mystery. They called her brave. Vanity Fair praised her grace. People magazine dropped the tabloid sheen and told the story with the honesty it deserved. Even longtime critics of the Osbourne brand admitted something had shifted. This wasn't reality TV. This was reality. What shocked everyone the most was that Aimee didn't speak publicly. She didn't issue a press statement or sit down for a tearful interview. She didn't need to. Her silence had always been her language, and now that silence was deafening in the best way, people began revisiting her music, searching for the truth she had been quietly singing all along under the name ARO. Lyrics that once seemed vague now carried thunderous meaning. Songs about broken bonds, isolation, healing, and love buried beneath years of dust. Even music executives took notice, realizing she had been speaking for years. We just hadn't been listening. But the impact didn't stop there. The story rehumanized Ozzy too. Gone was the caricature of a screaming, stumbling icon. In his place stood a father, tired, remorseful, and deeply moved by a daughter who chose forgiveness over pride. The rock god was now just a man, and people saw him differently because of her. Even Sharon Osbourne, known for her fire and grit, softened publicly. She spoke of holding on to hope for years, praying that one day Aimee would return, not for the cameras but for love. That moment finally arrived, and its impact was seismic. In a world constantly shouting, Aimee's quiet voice had become the loudest. Without trying to inspire anyone, she inspired everyone. And as her name trended, not as the forgotten daughter but as the one who found her way back, she reminded the world that forgiveness isn't weakness, and sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told without a single word. For years, Aimee Osbourne's voice wasn't completely silent, it was just hidden in plain sight. While the world obsessed over Ozzy's chaos and her siblings' reality TV antics, Aimee had been quietly creating music under the moniker ARO, pouring her truth into lyrics that most people dismissed as indie fringe, too moody, too mysterious, too far removed from the Osbourne brand. But in the wake of her emotional reunion with her father, listeners returned to those songs with fresh ears, and what they heard hit like a tidal wave. Every haunting note, every aching line suddenly felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. She hadn't been avoiding her family's fame, she had been processing it through art. Her music wasn't just sound, it was survival. Tracks once overlooked as brooding now rang out as confessions, diaries set to synth and subtle guitar. In one song she spoke of a shadow too loud to escape, a lyric that now felt like a direct reference to Ozzy's towering legacy. In another, she sang of being left outside the noise, which fans now realized was her way of articulating the emotional exile she chose to protect herself. And perhaps most devastatingly, a recently rediscovered track featured verses that mirrored the very apology she gave her father in private, lines about longing for connection, fearing rejection, and begging time to slow down. No big label promotion, no trending dance challenge, no shout-out from a celebrity friend, just raw music finding its audience the old-fashioned way, through truth. Her streams skyrocketed not because of marketing, but because people wanted to understand her. They weren't listening to ARO for entertainment anymore. They were listening to understand the pain behind the silence. Critics who had once ignored her began calling her one of the most underrated voices in alternative music. Fans began quoting her lyrics as mantras of healing and resilience. And Aimee, who had spent decades avoiding the spotlight, found herself at the center of a new kind of attention, one that wasn't asking for drama, but simply asking her to keep speaking through her music. In a world addicted to noise, she proved that vulnerability, whispered through melody, can echo louder than any headline. Her voice, once buried under years of family conflict and emotional withdrawal, was finally being heard not just by strangers, but by the very people who had once overlooked it. And as her songs spread, they didn't just tell Aimee's story, they told the stories of everyone who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or afraid to come home. For decades, Ozzy Osbourne's legacy was carved in chaos. Headlines about bats and booze, rehab stints and outbursts, reality show meltdowns, and metal anthems that defined rebellion for generations. But after Aimee's return and the emotional confession that followed, that image began to soften, not with spin or revisionist PR, but through a single undeniable truth. Even legends can be broken, and even broken men can crave forgiveness. The moment between Ozzy and Aimee, wordless, raw, and private, became a turning point not just for her healing but for his legacy. For the first time, fans stopped looking at Ozzy as just a myth and started seeing him as a man, one who had failed, fallen, and finally listened. No longer just the wild frontman of Black Sabbath or the confused dad bumbling through a reality series, Ozzy was now the grieving father who welcomed his estranged daughter with trembling hands and no defenses. His face, once synonymous with theatrics and madness, now held the weary tenderness of a man who knew he was running out of time. And in that vulnerability, his audience found something more meaningful than showmanship. They found sincerity. Old interviews resurfaced, but now fans noticed the cracks in his voice when he talked about his kids. Moments once dismissed as incoherent rants were revisited and reinterpreted as the cries of a man drowning in guilt, longing for connection but unable to say it out loud. His music, long hailed for its grit and darkness, now revealed undercurrents of sorrow and love that had been hiding in plain sight. The song he wrote for Aimee, long buried as a B-side, took on new meaning. People listened closely to My Little Man, a song for Jack, and heard not just fatherly pride but regret masked in melody. Ozzy had always been more than his headlines. He was a complicated, loving, wounded soul who struggled to be present but never stopped caring. And it was Aimee's courage, her choice to walk into that quiet room to forgive without cameras, that gave him the grace of being seen clearly before it was too late. The man once defined by outrageousness was now remembered for something far more human. The way he reached for his daughter's hand in silence, admitted his faults and accepted her love without flinching. That moment didn't erase decades of dysfunction, but it rewrote the ending. And for a legacy built on noise, it was the quietest act of love that finally gave it meaning. In a world obsessed with fame, spectacle, and noise, Aimee Osbourne did the unthinkable. She walked away, stayed silent, and chose peace over applause. For years, her absence from the Osbourne family circus was chalked up to rebellion, snobbery, or distance. But now, with the full weight of her story laid bare, it's clear she wasn't avoiding fame. She was protecting herself from a kind of pain most people wouldn't survive. Her quiet return to her father's side wasn't a comeback. It was a reckoning. A final act of courage from a daughter who had lived in emotional exile and still found it within herself to forgive. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her relationship with Ozzy, she reclaimed her own voice. She reminded the world that strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in a trembling apology, in a song written in the dark, or in a hug long overdue. Her decision to return wasn't made for headlines, and yet it changed headlines. It reframed a man the world thought it knew, and reintroduced a woman it never really saw. Her healing became a mirror, showing us what it means to choose love when it's hardest, to return home not for validation but for truth. Aimee didn't just challenge the narrative, she rewrote it. She showed that it's possible to grow up in a storm and still choose calm, that it's possible to love someone who failed you and still hold them accountable with kindness, and most importantly, that it's never too late to come back, not to the spotlight but to yourself. Ozzy Osbourne may be remembered for his music, his madness, and his myth, but to Aimee, his legacy will always be something smaller and far more sacred. The final quiet moment where a daughter reached out, a father held on, and forgiveness finally found its way through the noise. In the end, she didn't need a reality show, a press tour, or a viral soundbite. She had something better: the courage to speak from the heart, the grace to forgive, and the strength to walk away from fame without ever looking back. And that, more than any headline or heavy metal anthem, is the real story that deserves to be remembered.